Let's get started. I know we're a minute early, but since our most important person is here, our speaker, let's get this kicked off. So, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today with the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations for our Model Arab League podcast. Today's speaker is Jason Pack. We'll be talking about Libya, but first, before I do a formal introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Michael to lay down the ground rules about the briefing. Michael?
Right. Thank you, Josh. So the way it's going to go is just make sure when we start you have your cameras and videos turned off, and it looks like everyone has done that, so well done. There'll be no recording of the lecture. We have our own recording going, and we'll distribute it once we have screened it and made sure everything's good to go. We'll have a question and answer session at the end, and you can find the comment bar at the top right of your screen next to your photo. If you click on that, you can input your questions, and we'll read them off when we get to that section. And you can do it a little bit beforehand if you have something that you think up and you don't want to lose it along the way. So put your questions in as you think them up, and we'll be good to go. If you use this for research down the line, there's no attribution of speakers, so you can use the info that you gained here today, but it's best if you don't directly quote or, I guess, comment on the speakers and the information they provided. So with that, Josh, back to you.
Thank you, Michael, so much. I really appreciate that. We're very lucky today to have with us Jason Pack. It seems that at any given time in Washington, there's only about one person who can be an expert on Libya. It's a very difficult subject. It's very difficult to find people that have traveled and experienced the country and have a good contact base within the country. If you went back about 15 years ago when I first started this career, I remember Larry Velty at the Near East South Asia Center. He was the expert on Libya in this town, and there was no one else beyond him. Today, 15 years on, that person, that honor goes to Jason Pack, who's with us today. I can't think of anyone who knows Libya better than him in Washington. He's one of the leading experts on the country with his own consultancy and many years of experience writing and working on this topic. I'm going to turn it over to him. He's prepared a PowerPoint presentation for us today, which is very extensive, and I want to give him a chance to be able to explore his own thoughts and ideas extensively in that regard, starting with the history of the country. With that, I'd like to introduce Jason Pack. Jason?
Well, thank you for that kind words, Josh. And it's really an honor to be invited to speak to you and the Model Arab League podcast. So I've entitled my talk, From Qadhafi to Chaos, Libya's Centrality in Western Geostrategy, or more simply, Why Libya Matters. Next slide. Like many of you all, as an American, I didn't grow up going to or connected to the Middle East in any way, but rather it was events in geopolitics and the news that I saw that first got me involved in the Middle East. I'm from Manhattan, and when 9/11 happened, I happened to be studying biology for my undergrad in Massachusetts. The 9/11 affected me deeply, and I chose to quit science and move to Beirut when I graduated. I assumed that I needed to learn Arabic to get ahead in this field. Bizarrely, that turns out not to be true. But, my quest to get a decent accent took me to get a Fulbright in Syria and to live about 7 years in the region. Next slide. A few years later, it was gradually dawning on me how ineffective academia would be as a way to make an impact. So I dropped out of my first attempt to get a DPhil at Oxford to go to Tripoli in 2008 and work for a consultancy there. So as they say in the field, once you go Libya, you never go back. So I've been a full-time Libyanist for going on 12 years now. And along the way, I've become something of an accidental entrepreneur with stints as a media commentator, a think tanker, a consultant, and a trade association professional. But one idea has unified all of my endeavors. And this is trying to make the case writ large of why Libya is so important for the US, why it's worth American foreign policymakers to invest significant diplomatic, financial, and military resources to the country. Sadly, given the myopia of this administration, this has been a bit of an uphill battle. But the argument that I put forth is actually one that I have heard administration appointees agree with. So there could be some hope for re-engagement in Libya. And that's that Libya is our fifth most important and most pressing theater of global conflict. And in fact, it's the theater which is key to our whole Africa and MENA strategy, as it safeguards our long-term interests, as well as those of our European allies in the Mediterranean basin region, as well as the Saharan region, and MENA writ large. So, according to this view, Libya is a top-tier conflict only dwarfed in importance by the Russia-Ukraine theater, the Syria-Iraq theater, the North Korea-East China Sea theater, and then the never-ending crisis in Yemen with all its ramifications in the Gulf. And now we'll, of course, expect naysayers in the audience, and that's fine. Americans are raised on the Monroe Doctrine and tend to believe that implosions in Venezuela or Cuba or the drug war in Mexico are more deeply connected to our national interests as they hit closer to home, or that for emotional reasons, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is somehow paramount to our US geostrategic interests. Next slide. Independent of how important it is, and I'm going to make the case that Libya is very important, Libya is exceptional. It bestrides the Mediterranean, African, and Middle Eastern geographic systems, as we can see in our map here. But Libya is also a pretty quirky place. It's top of the league tables, first in the world, in so many interesting categories. You might know that Libya has the highest amount of proven oil reserves in Africa, but you probably don't know that it has the most traffic fatalities per capita globally, or that very credible forecasts have shown that its economy will be the one which contracts the most due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It would appear that Libya's GDP will decrease by more than 60%. It's also the world's largest proliferator of small arms and the country of embarkation for the majority of illegal African migrants to Europe. Fascinatingly and most paradoxically, Libya is the most subsidized nation on earth, but it's the largest piece of land on earth that is not really a nation, inasmuch as it's terra nullius, i.e. a place where conceptions of sovereignty have lapsed. In this vein, Libya has two governments, but in reality, zero government, as notions of both Weberian and international legal sovereignty no longer apply there. And possibly, and most interestingly of all, the current Libyan civil war is the only war in recorded history in which the very same body, in this case, the Central Bank of Libya, has been the primary funder of both sides of the war. Now for a terminological note. I use the standard conventions in the field that many people who are not in this field are not aware of. We don't call what happened in 2011 a civil war. Those can be referred to as uprisings or revolution. And the reason why civil war is inaccurate is that a civil war is a term of art for when the populace is equally on both sides. So in 2014, we have the Tobruk-Tripoli split and the first Libyan civil war. And then from 2019 to the present, we have the second Libyan civil war. Whereas in 2011, we had the Arab Spring events, which were an uprising. They were multipolar, they were disconnected. They were an uprisings or a revolution. And in fact, if you make extension to other Arab Spring situations, you can see why this has to be the case. No one speaks of an Egyptian civil war, which culminated in Mubarak's ouster, nor do we speak of a Tunisian civil war. We could speak of an Egyptian uprising or a Tunisian uprising. So that's a very important way of looking at things. Whereas what's been happening since 2014 in Libya is truly a civil conflict, pitting region against region, town against town, and social group against social group, or local council against jihadis. So if we were to explain the state of Libya, the state of play in Libya in one paragraph, I would say we have entered a multipolar civil war between various local and regional militias. There are two governments in the country, each claiming legitimacy. However, one of the governments is dwarfed by the fact that it supports the rogue general Haftar and his LNA. For over a year now, the oil infrastructure has been almost completely controlled by that rogue general Haftar. But bizarrely, when the oil is flowing, it goes to his opponents, the UN-backed Government of National Accord, or GNA. Since April 2019, the UN process has been, the UN mediation process has been moribund because Haftar attacked Tripoli. However, in the last few weeks, there's been a very positive reversal, which is that defenders have pushed Haftar from the gates of Tripoli and made some key victories in Sorman and Sabrata and are attacking the Watia airbase as we go to press with this. My contention is that all of Libya's economic, migrant, and jihadi woes all have the same root cause, and that's that the country's lack of governance institutions and its bizarre economic structures give rise to state implosion. So it's the root cause is the lack of a functioning Libyan state and the wrong economic incentives, and the symptoms are the jihadis, the migrants, and all of that other stuff. Okay, next slide. This presentation is going to be a little bit of a blitzkrieg because Libya ain't no Kuwait when it comes to complexity, if you know what I'm saying. So we got a lot to cover. The landmass of, to go back in history, to start, at the beginning, the landmass of Libya was truly one of the major fault lines in the ancient world. To quote the most famous anthropologist of Libya, Edward Evans Pritchard, he said that the human fault line between Cyrenaica in the east and Tripolitania in the west is the most major breaking point in the ancient world. Essentially, the Greek world is to the east of the Cerdican, and the Roman or Punic world is to the west. That might be an exaggeration, but he is hitting at something, because today, to the east of the Cerdican, we have Mashriqi dialects, and to the west of the Cerdican, we have Maghribi dialects. To the east of the Cerdican, we have a population which can trace itself mostly to the peninsula due to the Beni Hilal invasions. But to the west, we have a population that has never been fully Arabized, either in dialect or in DNA. So, if we fast forward to the Ottoman period, Libya is the last part of North Africa to be gobbled up by the colonial powers. And in fact, it only exists as an entity in as much as it's the bit that remained of North Africa after the French had taken Tunis and Egypt was annexed by the British. The three Ottoman wilayat that were left became Libya. And Libya also has another uniqueness. It's the only part of the Arab world to be colonized by the Italians. And colonialism affected it quite differently than elsewhere. Libya is the only part of the Arab world that had less population when its colonizers were ejected in 1942 than when its colonizers entered in 1911. So people can talk about the displacement of the Palestinians or the genocide against the Algerians, but in 1830, there were less than 1 million Muslim Algerians when the French entered, and there were more than 10 million in 1962. And in the start of the Zionist enterprise in the 1880s, we had less than 100,000 living between the river and the sea. And even those who were not displaced still in just post-1947 Gaza and the West Bank are more than 600,000. So we're talking about population growth. Whereas in Libya, you actually can speak of a genocide, because in 1911, we have 1.3 million residents of the territory of Libya. But in 1942, due to the Italian concentration camps, strafing from the air, and raids against the Bedouin, we have only 800,000. So there really is a genocide against the Cyrenaican Bedouin that can be shown in population figures. Okay, so given Libya's history, we like to think of regime inversion as the primary way of understanding what's gone on there. Cycles of regime inversion. What does that mean? The Ottomans worked with the urban elites. Then the Senussi and the interior Bedouin fought against the Italians and came to power and dominance. But then when the Italians, after they crushed the Senussi rebellion from 1931 onward, they ruled through similar urban and Tripolitanian elites that the Ottomans had used. Then when the British evict the Ottomans, they side with the Senussia and the interior tribes against the urban dwellers. When Qadhafi comes to power in 1969, he sides with interior tribes from the center part of the country rather than the eastern and Senussi tribes or Senussi-aligned tribes that the Italians had used. And the 2011 revolution kicks it back by hurting the Qadhafi tribes, disadvantaging them, and bringing to the forefront other groups. So cycles of regime inversion. Next slide. Everyone knows probably one thing about Qadhafi, and then that is that he did Lockerbie, as it were. I'm not sure he actually did it, but he got punished for it. And the UN imposed the sanctions from 1992 to 1999, which were the most blanket sanctions. What they did was they really prevented any travel of Libyans to study abroad or get training abroad, and the importation of lots of goods, which caused the regime to stop terror and led to its seeking to open up. Due to talks with the Americans, particularly Martin Indyk, and then the British, Sir Mark Allen, Moussa Koussa succeeds in getting the sanctions lifted in 2003, and we start the détente period. The détente period causes the Libyans to give up their nuclear program and their chemical weapons programs. It also allows the internet and modern global capitalism to enter Libya, without which there wouldn't have been the 2011 uprising. So it was Qadhafi's détente that raised expectations, kind of like a perestroika or a glasnost, and led to what was able to happen in 2011. If he had stayed hermetically sealed like the North Korea of North Africa, as he was in the sanctions period, there wouldn't have been an Arab Spring movement there. Next slide. Oil. I mentioned that what keeps Libya together is its oil sector. It accounts for more than 95% of GDP. Oil was discovered quite late in Libya, but the infrastructure was built very rapidly in the 60s, almost exclusively by American companies. And then Libya starts the nationalization in 1970 and initiates the oil blockade in 1973 that leads to the Arab oil embargo. So Libya has moved markets and been central to how oil is priced and owned globally. But what Libya has done differently than any other oil country on earth is it has not created a centralized bureaucracy. All other oil countries, think Saudi, Kuwait, even Nigeria, create bureaucracies which administer the oil infrastructure. Even a dysfunctional country like Venezuela is centralized. Libya doesn't have that. Libya has tribal and decentralized dynamics more like Yemen, despite the fact that its oil wealth per person would be more like Kuwait, even wealthier than Saudi, if it was administered properly. Another thing to note is that Libya doesn't have any major sectarian cleavages. Next slide. So if we're talking about the population, Libya is 90 to 95% Sunni Muslim. The Ibadis, who tend to be the in the Western Desert or the Jabal Nafusa area, are not that because their form of Ibadism is not that stigmatized by the population. Yes, there are Tuareg and Tebu in the south, but they're Sunni. The Tuareg were discriminated against because of their deep ties with the Qadhafi regime. The Tebu have always been discriminated against because of their black skin. So, other interesting features of the Libyan population. Libya is third per capita in the world in terms of small arms per capita, topped only by, the US and Yemen. Very proud about that. And Libya has more small arms in the country than 100 times the arsenal of the British Army. Continue with this theme of Libyan exceptionalism. Let's discuss a little bit more about the peculiarities of the economy, which until 2010 was the wealthiest per capita in all of Africa, but has in the last few years become plunged into an almost sub-Saharan level of poverty. And with oil not flowing at all since January, Libya is likely to kind of re-third world eyes, sadly. Next slide, slide 9. We are on the issue of Libya's unique economic institutions. I term them Libya's semi-sovereign economic institutions. These are not really centralized and coherent economic institutions. Rather, Libya differs from all Arab oil societies by being what some scholars like Dirk van de Wal or Lisa Anderson have termed stateless. That's to say, Qadhafi didn't create a central functioning bureaucracy, nor did he create chains of command. In trying to build something like a Nasserist social republic from 1969 to 1973, Qadhafi was trying to involve the masses in government. Then he invented a new form of political organization called the Jamahiriya, or massocracy. And in theory, this system was to let the people exhibit direct democracy. What it really meant was allowing Qadhafi to control everything, but to have official institutions like Ministry of Finance or the army be powerless and have informal institutions govern everything. So there could have been in the BPC or GPC a minister of oil, but he didn't control anything because the NOC controlled it. And there could be a minister of the economy, but that controlled nothing because the semi-sovereigns at the Privatization and Investment Board, or my favorite, the Hijaz Tanmiya wa Tatwir al Marakiz al Idariya, the Organization for the Development of Administrative Centers, would be the real power center of the economy. With such a hysterical title, you might be surprised to know that ODAC, despite being defunct, has more than 400 billion in liabilities and over 10 billion on its balance sheet. So Libya is governed by these very bizarre holding company semi-sovereigns. NOC, LIA, CBL, LIA has about 60 billion in sovereign wealth. GCAL creates the electricity. And each one has its own fiefdom. And that kind of worked in the Qadhafi period because the buck stopped with Qadhafi. Yes, ODAC was a fiefdom, but if they got out of line, the head of ODAC would just be sent to prison. Now, since Qadhafi's passing, the situation has gotten far worse. There's a distinct case to be made that the heads of the CBL and the NOC are far more powerful than the rival prime ministers, Athini or Siraj, but they don't answer to them because Athini doesn't have an army. Haftar does. Siraj doesn't have an army. The militias do. If Kabir doesn't want to give money, Kabir is the central bank governor, if he doesn't want to give money to the budget of the government has no way to compel him. So since the end of the Qadhafi period, the key alphabet soup of agencies has largely remained the same, but who they report to and who they answer to is unclear. Or is held by these personalized institutions, which then enter into league with the militias, who act as criminal syndicates and can pressure the institutional heads. Real power, therefore, in Libya is found in the local level institutions like municipal councils and militia, but they don't have the power to set macroeconomic policy or issue tenders. Those major contracts still need to happen with these semi-sovereign institutions, which leads for a lot of corruption. Next slide. Libya is the land of the semi-sovereign quasi-state economic institution that is unanswerable to government or to its peers, but can be exploited by the militias and has a very bizarre economic model. Now, I'm in a fortunate position. Over the last few years, I've actually met the head of every major semi-sovereign economic institution, and I understand the Libyan economy in its peculiarities. Libya is the most subsidized country on earth. To show you how bizarre this is, Libyan petrol is officially priced at 15 dinar cents a liter. On the black market, that would mean it's 3 cents a liter. So for Americans, that means that Libyan petrol is 12 cents a gallon. That's the cheapest on earth. A Libyan tomato costs 9 times as much to grow as it does to import one from Italy, but yet it is priced at the same price as the Italian tomato in the Libyan store. Libya also produces electricity at the least efficiency of any place on earth. Libyan electricity is generated somewhere like 32 to 33 US cents a kilowatt, but then it's sold at 1 cent a kilowatt to the customer, but 99% of households do not pay anything. They don't even pay the 1 cent. Therefore, Libyan electricity costs 10,000 times to produce what GCAL is able to collect in fees for its electricity from the populace. Okay, if you thought it sounds weird, it's going to get weirder. Letters of credit are instruments of essentially free money, which are given preferentially to people who know people to import goods at the official rate of the dinar. But there's no proof that the goods are actually imported. So the letters of credit system allows people who have connection to the central bank governor to essentially print free money. Next slide. Now, what does all of this economic dysfunction lead to in a political perspective? Well, it has caused the 2014 first civil war because If you're in a militia, you can use your arms to get access to letters of credit and to smuggle refined petrol, as well as to do human trafficking. So in 2014, we had the airport war, and that was when the results of the June 25th, 2014 election were not respected throughout the country. And we saw the rise of Libya Dawn, who rejected those elections, and then Libya Dignity, which is General Haftar, who made a coup claiming to be the rightful authority and saying that he alone could defeat the terrorist menace. And it was at that point that the HOR fled to Tobruk and said that it was still Libya's legitimate government. Next slide. So, given that Libya has so much wealth and such a great geostrategic location, it should come as no surprise that the foreign actors have piled in. In fact, Libya is completely penetrated by foreign actors and is a place in which major civilized European and Western nations are on opposite sides. So the French support Haftar, but the Italians are the primary diplomatic backers of the GNA within Europe. Conversely, the Qataris and the Turks support the Islamist currents as well as the GNA, as they do elsewhere throughout the region, whereas the UAE, Saudi, and Egypt support the anti-Islamists as well as the Madkhali Salafists. And America and the UK are, in theory, supposed to mediate and balance, but have taken a hands-off approach since Trump came to office and Brexit has been the primary issue. Next slide. So that's been a quick overview of the political situation. I'd like to point out what's happening now. We have entered 13 months ago the second war for post-Qadhafi succession, or sometimes termed the war for Tripoli. Just when the national conference, the culmination of years of UN mediation, was going to begin in Ghadames, Haftar attacked Tripoli at exactly the moment that the UN Secretary General, Gutierrez, was in Tripoli. And despite this huge affront, we, the West or the UN or NATO, have done nothing to push back against that. Whereas the UAE, Russia, and Egypt have piled in to make sure that Haftar was outsupplying his enemies. However, because it's not possible for Haftar to win because the country is too big, he doesn't have enough supporters, and Tripoli is a densely populated city, he hasn't been able to take Tripoli even with Russian mercenaries, UAE-funded drones, and Egyptian logistical support and training. Just in the last 2 months, the Turks have increased their aerial capacity and have tipped the balance in the air war now back in favor of the GNA, allowing the GNA to essentially push Haftar from Tripoli. And it seems like Tripoli is no longer in threat, and we're going to move to another phase in this war. Okay, so that wraps up my overview of the political situation. Next slide. I would like to take us to the themes. And one of these themes is ISIS. ISIS was able to take hold in Libya and regain more than a foothold because it's a permissive environment, as I mentioned. If you've got a militia, you can smuggle refined petrol, you can do human trafficking, you can do drugs, you could even get letters of credit. So much of jihadism in Libya has been from how permissive it is. They put the jihadis on state salaries and they barely have to fight. They just get money that way. They don't have to do the difficult way of funding jihadis in Iraq. So ISIS came on the back of people who had fought in Syria and in Afghanistan. And it was first kind of ensconcing itself in Derna in 2014, but it was so brutal, that brutality backfired. The population rejected it in favor of Al-Qaeda linked groups. It took Sirte in 2015 and had essentially control over Sirte, just like Raqqa or Mosul. Only the US, working with the Misratans and Banyan Marsus, has been able to kick the jihadis out. Now I want to tell you a little bit about my charity. If we go to the next slide. My charity is Eye on ISIS in Libya. We're a 501c3. And we're a repository of nonpartisan cross-check information about the development of the Islamic State in Libya. And that's all available for free online. Studying our data set of over 20,000 documents and lots of publications, what have we concluded? It's that the Libyan political vacuum and statelessness creates and nurtures jihadism. Jihadism is not intrinsic to Libya. Libyans reject jihadis and don't want them in their communities. So the way a stagnant pool creates bacteria while a flowing stream kills them, it's the lack of the state that allows jihadis to fester. Whereas if we had a state that was functional, we wouldn't have a jihadi problem in Libya. Next slide. You can see some of the maps that my team has created that gives you a little bit of an overview. And in Libya, like Yemen, Al-Qaeda-linked groups have done a better job than their ISIS-linked counterparts at staying rooted to local concerns, local actors, and evolving country dynamics, particularly given the latter's heavier reliance on foreign fighters to assimilate to the global ISIS franchise. Essentially, ISIS was too foreign and too brutal, and it got defeated. Next slide. It was ISIS's very brutality and territorial overreach that led to its demise, whereas Al-Qaeda-linked groups are still strong in the country because their core supporters are rooted in those towns. So Al-Qaeda seems to understand the old adage, sometimes less is more. Next slide. But for an American audience, the point I want to make is that we have seen ISIS as being super important. Oh, ISIS is out of Libya, or blah, blah, blah. ISIS is just in the south. So, Libya is not a top tier issue anymore. Well, that's crazy because ISIS is a symptom, not a cause. The cause is the state implosion. And in fact, more important than ISIS has always been the migrant issue. The migrant issue is what drove European politics to the right. Without the implosion of the Libyan or Syrian states, you could never have Brexit or the rise of the five-star movement in Italy. It was those migrant flows that led to the rise of neopopulism in places like Italy and Britain. Next slide. So pretty much the number one issue in all of European foreign policy is migration and stopping its flow through Libya and through Turkey. We all know about UKIP, Front National, AFD. The Libyan power vacuum post-2011 draws in regional players, but emits out migrants. And if we just try to treat the symptoms, i.e. pushing the migrants back in an unhumanitarian way at sea, or, trying to intervene in Mali, or things like that, or, beefing up the Nigerian military, that's not going to solve the migrant issue. It's the implosion of the Libyan state, which is the root cause. Next slide, slide 20, conclusions. ISIS cannot be fully defeated if Libya remains a completely ungoverned space. It has too much wealth, too close a proximity to Europe, and too leaky borders, the Libyan state. Similarly, you can't deal with the migration issue if the Libyan state is so porous. So the bizarre Western exclusive focus on ISIS in Libya is not going to get the job done, because Libya's weak institutions can only be dealt with through a political process that deals with the economic drivers of who controls the billions of dollars, like all those semi-sovereign institutions that allow the subsidies that I mentioned. So you might say, well, Libya is far away. Libya is a quagmire. It's the Europeans' problem. Shouldn't the US deal with matters closer to home? But no, Libya is a linchpin in the whole post-Cold War system that we are actually seeing falling apart. And it is the inability of the US as the declining hegemon to maintain order in places like Libya that has really led to our inability to keep a global system where our allies actually work with us. Because in Libya, we see the Italians and the French working against each other because there's not been any leadership. Next slide. My argument is that only the US can lead in Libya. We're seen as neutral. We haven't really committed to the GNA or the LNA. We, working with the UK, have the linkages to the Gulfi actors that we can use carrots and sticks to get them out. And we have the connection to the private sector, which can do capacity building, state building. And wouldn't it be great to get our private sector in there, because Libya is unique among the world's top 5 conflicts that it can actually pay for itself. Libya has lost 1 million jobs for guest workers from 2010 to now. Wouldn't it be nice in this time of COVID to create 1 million jobs and to put 50 billion in Libyan spending back per year into mega projects? Sounds like a good idea to me. I'd like to deploy US diplomatic clout and our neutrality to work with our European allies and box out destabilizing Gulf actors. That's the way to treat the root causes. And it turns out that Libyans like America. In fact, in 2012, when non-American nations were polled about their opinions about America, only one nation had a higher impression of Americans than Canada, and that nation was Libya. So the US needs to lead in Libya geopolitically, and Libyans would welcome that leadership if it was done in a neutral way. Okay, so that's my talk. Thank you. Shall I bang on and talk a little bit about my consultancy, or shall we pause for a second?
Let's pause for a quick second if we can. First, I want to thank you. That was an outstanding presentation. We very much appreciate it, Jason. It was both comprehensive and very eloquent. Eloquent in the sense that you're very precise with your terminology, you're very precise with the way you use your words, and a lot of thought and care was put into every aspect of what you want to present. And we very much appreciate that. It's an enormous amount of care that you put into this today. With that in mind, I do want to ask you a bit about your consultancy, because part of what we're doing with this series is not just to overview the different countries in the region, but also to offer students a chance to understand the types of careers that are out there. I know as when I was a student, when many of us were students, it was very hard to tell, where do you go in this field? What is the field of Middle East studies writ large? And once you get more into it, you find there's a whole diversity of careers that are possible, of all shapes and sizes. Now, you have a consultancy. Of course, it's a niche consultancy in as much as it is focused on Libya. Then again, it's rare in that it is focused on Libya. And what I'd like to do is get a sense from you of what it's like to interact with both policymakers and the private sector, not only gathering information, but also sharing insights of a historical nature, of an analytical nature, of a cultural or sociological nature, with people from all walks of society. Can you give us a bit of a sense of the position that you occupy in that regard?
Wow, that's a great question. So why don't I have us go to the next slide, and I'll tell you how it kind of all got started, and inter alia will address those questions. I didn't want to be a consultant. I thought I was going to be an academic, but I ended up being an accidental entrepreneur, because I left Oxford thinking, hey, I don't really think you can make a difference by being in a field where many of my colleagues are researching 18th century Nablusi soap traders and getting Fulbrights to study the use of the C minor chord in Egyptian pop music. So I wanted to be in the game. And once I was in the game, the Arab Spring happened to happen, and I made a website for myself, because with the Arab Spring happening and my having met many of the main players in the Qadhafi regime, I was able to, write in The Guardian and be on CNN and things like that. And I didn't know how to do consulting, so I made a website, and I modeled myself after Josh Landis and his Syria comment. I just did a little bit of a blog, and I put my media clips on it. And I called it a company, so different than Josh at Syria Comment. I said, we're Libya Analysis, and you can just, work with us. In the good years of 2012, 2013, people wrote asking for due diligence. Let's go to the next slide. And, they would ask things like, hey, how do I sell Caterpillar machines in Libya? Or, oh, I would really like to know, is it safe to go to Maitiga Airport? So to answer those questions, I initially would work with my Libyan friends in Libya, who were like my network. But then I had to hire Westerners who could process reports and do inquiries. Now we have 7 people at my consultancy, and I'm actually in the middle of hiring 1 more. And my top person is about to go on maternity leave, which kind of shows that my whole thing is gestating, you might say. Next slide. And what do? Now that there really aren't market entry requests and due diligence has dried up since 2014 due to the civil wars, people are interested in the security situation, but they're interested in which ports are safe. Can I lift crude at Ras Lanuf, or should we lift that crude at Sidra? And we have a complex OSINT system to, read Arabic Twitter, to talk to different people, to deal with the commentariat, to answer questions like that. Mine is the only consultancy that since 2011, every week produces a report on all 14 of the Libyan ports, their threat levels, what's affecting them. And then as I was doing that, clients would ask things like, oh, but what about infrastructure? What about the pipelines? What about the airport? What about the this? What about the that? So then, next slide, we've developed a whole range of products from stakeholder mapping, conflict mapping, forecasting. Like, unfortunately, there's not any crude being produced now, but I have clients in the commodities trading space. Oh, is crude going to go up or down next week? If the Libyan oil goes out, which is going through the Riaina valve from El Feel, is that going to move the market globally? So we forecast. I would love to say that I have governments who subscribe to these things because I think the stakeholder mapping and conflict mapping would be amazing for them. They don't. Government is a piggybacker. I get invited to brief. In a way, I'm briefing the US government via a talk like this indirectly. I was in Vicenza in Italy just before the start of the pandemic in January, and I was speaking to AFRICOM there. They don't buy my product. I think they should, but they want an in-person briefing, meet the Major General, give a talk to our cadets, things like that. So I brief the British a lot, particularly the British Army. But again, the British Army doesn't consume these products, even though they would be useful from an intelligence perspective. Next slide. Here's an example of a kind of product that we produce for the private sector. We've broken down an executive summary of what happened that week and what are the scenarios. What if the LNA refuses to export crude? What if they do export the crude? If it then increases and the NOC suspends operations, what if this? So next slide. As part of this product, we've mapped all of the Libyan oil infrastructure, and you can click on it and see a satellite maps. Oh, Zawiya, there's the refinery. How does it work? It has hydro skimming. 10% of the Zawiya refinery needs are met by Hamada crude. It turns out that even the Libyan oil company doesn't have this level of information. And ENI, which operates Melita, doesn't have the kind of information about the way in which the different militia actors and stakeholders bear upon their infrastructure at Melita. I'm the only one in the world who has this because I've met with them and I meet with government. They're like, this is a huge amount of information, but we don't have the ability to buy it. My private sector clients are ahead of the curve. And this is just part of the paradox of why government is not able to deal with things like a pandemic, because it doesn't have the capacity to have decision makers processing information in the amount of detail which is required. So next slide. My consultancy tries to produce the most elite information for clients who really do have that capacity. As a result, I have 2 Fortune 500 companies who would be interested in questions like, tell me every time there's hate speech on Twitter relating to Libya. Tell me every single incident in which, for example, a militia group has blocked a valve going all the way back to 2011. So we're a repository of information with something like over 100,000 unique incidents that are logged in our proprietary systems. So when I write a think tank reports like those shown here for Hate Speech International or NATO or the Atlantic Council, I'm drawing on this repository of information that has been unparalleled, that I've been able to build up by employing tens of Libyan correspondents and over the years, 5 or 6 employees who then just process this fire hose of information. Okay, last slide, and I'm ready for questions.
Okay, yes, thank you. That's fantastic. I would just comment that Jason's been doing this for a number of years with his consultancy. There are newer, more diverse consultancies doing a range of issues across the region whose primary clients are Western governments. And I would say one of the big differences between what Jason's doing and what they're doing that defines their access to government clients is their ability to have a dedicated person or a team of people whose sole job is to try and get those contracts. It's a challenging aspect of the business. Appealing to corporate sector clients, it's a little bit easier if what you're doing appeals to the bottom line of what they're trying to accomplish. They will see the benefit of it. Trying to market to Western governments is a little more challenging because you're dealing with so many facets of a bureaucracy that is so closed in so many ways and so opaque that it almost takes a dedicated person or team of people to persist in cracking that nut. And as a result, you've got certain consultancies like Jason that do end up with more corporate sector clients and those that don't. And it's not for lack of trying. It's simply by the nature of the beast. With that,
Correct.
I'm going to turn it over to Go on,
I
Jason.
completely agree, and I would love to get my products in, bureaus like CSO, INR, ENR, the intelligence community, of course. But as you pointed out, I see kind of structural problems with how the US and even the UK government produce knowledge products. Do you know what I mean? The preference for in-house, a whole range of what's considered confidential or not. And I think that that's something which is worth tossing out to people, because Americans, more than Brits who get into Middle East, tend to see, oh, if I really want to make an impact, or I want to be brainy, or I want to get into the juiciest details, I've got to work for the IC, I've got to get in the government. Whereas a Brit tends to think, no, in fact, if I want to have the real information and deal with the super sexy stuff, then I leave my job in the British military and I go work in the private sector. And that's what we've found, that by being in the private sector and working for these clients who really have bottom lines that you mentioned, we're able to deal with, in a way, sexier information, driven in a more useful manner because there's no procurement issues.
Okay, with that, I want to turn over to Michael. He can read out some of the questions. Michael, we'll turn it to you.
Awesome. So this one goes back to Qadhafi. And could you talk a little bit about the current status of his Great Man-Made River project?
Great. I've been on the Great Man-Made River. It is the most important piece of artificial water technology in the world. And there are times that the militias hijack it or turn it off to deny water to civilian populations to kind of bribe the government or have the government appease them. That's been happening a bit, but not that much, fortunately, of late. And the man-made river is there. It's depleting the aquifers in Kufra, and it's very environmentally unsound, but there it is. It's still functioning.
All right, next question is about funding from the UAE. Can you talk a little bit more about UAE's investment in the conflicts in Libya? How wedded are they to Hiftar? What are the long-term goals? And what are the other outside funders at this time?
That's a very good question. Of course, the UAE is quite wedded to Haftar. And by the way, I'm not seeing myself now. I'm seeing the empty screen thing. So yes, they have an ideological project to defeat the Muslim Brotherhood wherever they can. And since 2011, they've been trying to make sure that no Muslim Brotherhood aligned groups come to power in Libya. And for some reason, unfortunately, they think the GNA is one such group. So they mediate their influence through Haftar. They also work with the Egyptians there and the Saudis and the Russians, just as they do in other theaters. The Emiratis, despite losing a bit, don't seem to be trying to back off. And that's just the way that it is, unfortunately. So they are the ones who prolong the war because they backstop Haftar with drones and money. However, the Turks have stepped up to the plate on the other side, and they are the all-purpose funder, armor, trainer of the GNA. And therefore, we have beyond a proxy war. I like to call it an extraterritorial war, because in a proxy war like in Syria, the Syrians do the fighting, and the outside backers back different militias. In the drone war in Libya, the Libyans don't fly the drones. They don't choose the targets. So we have a truly extraterritorial war where Turkey confronts the UAE over the Libyan airspace. The Libyans are the civilians who die, but the war in the air is truly fought between Turkey and the UAE.
All right, and during the NATO invasion in 2011, what are some of the lessons learned that came out of that? And then was the fracturing of the country inevitable, or could there have been ways that the intervention could have prevented that from happening?
Well, this is a very loosely worded question. There's no NATO invasion. That makes it sound like there were NATO ground troops who like stormed in D-Day the shores of Libya. So no, there was no NATO invasion. There was a NATO support mission following up on an Arab League resolution and then UNSCR 1973. So I don't even like to call it an intervention. It was merely a support for what the Arab League and the sovereign in becoming, the NTC, had asked for. Were there ways that fragmentation could have been avoided? Oh, yes. I thought that it wasn't likely that Libya would become Kuwait on the Mediterranean, but it's quite plausible. It doesn't have sectarian cleavages. There's no history of civil war, blah, blah, blah. What went on, of course, is the feckless leadership of the Libyans themselves, their desire to do appeasement. I mean, you could look at my Libya's Faustian bargains, breaking the appeasement cycle, Atlantic Council, or other work that I've done on ISIS and other things, and the failure of leadership. In a way, my book, which should be coming out in 2021, deals with the issue of all the potential that Libya had and all of the missteps. The fragmentation was by no means inevitable, and it certainly doesn't have to do with NATO policy, other than that there wasn't a commitment in the White House to helping in the reconstruction phase. Obama says that his greatest foreign policy regret was that he didn't help enough in the reconstruction phase from 2012 onward. And I think that David Cameron has essentially said that that's also his greatest foreign policy regret. So I would say that there was an extent to which generals as well as presidents fight the last war. And in Iraq, there was a thought that we had intervened and had been too heavy-handed. So in Libya, they took a hands-off approach and unfortunately didn't give enough capacity building assistance to help the Libyans fill the gap and avoid the issue of ungoverned space.
All right, and my apologies for if I said invasion. The question did phrase it as intervention, so I misworded that by mistake. And could you talk a little bit more about Trump's current approach to Libya, and what are the current drivers for that policy, as well as how Gulf spending has impacted Libya policy?
Oh, this is an excellent question. The Trump administration has an ambivalent approach in the sense that even before he got inaugurated, after he was elected, he made some pro-Haftar comments. People like Flynn and even Bolton have been known as having alliances with the East against the official State Department policy. I refer to a war on the banks of the Potomac between the administration appointees and what they would term the deep state. The deep state, meaning DOD and the State Department, follow the international protocols and the Scarrat agreement that require us to recognize the GNA. And then there's some appointees who do their own thing and make connections to Haftar and the Haftar sons. However, they haven't really been very successful in that. And US policy has essentially been the same as it would have been under Obama, with a few moments where ambiguity is done on purpose, like the Trump phone call of April 19th, 2019. Oh, actually, it was talked about on April 19th, 2019, but the phone call was on April 15th, 2019, where Trump called Haftar on behalf of Sisi. And that gets at the second part of the question. The administration is willing to pawn our Libya policy out to our Gulf donors and do various things when the Gulfies demand it. So the UAE insisted that we block the Algerian candidate to be SRSG to Libya. So they did, they blocked him. The UAE also worked with Sisi to get Trump to call Haftar on April 15th. So at various points, it is UAE and Egyptian lobbying, as well as Saudi lobbying, that causes the administration to re-engage at the top level. But at the medium and working level, essentially the ambassador and the embassy tick on and they do their normal stuff just like they would have done under an Obama administration.
All right, and you've answered a lot of good questions. I'm actually going to post one of my own. We have a lot of students who watch these videos and who are interested in Libya. Could you list out book suggestions that you might have for people who want to explore these issues further and just learn about it in general?
Sure. I mean, anyone who watches this video who wants to learn about Libya can write me at jason@libya-analysis.com. I have a proprietary book list where I have what I call the 5 greatest hits of Libya and then 20 supporting books. The best book ever written on Libya is the one that I referenced by Edward Evans Pritchard, the famous Oxford Don who invented social anthropology. It's called The Senussi of Cyrenaica, written in 1949. So that's the best book ever written about Libya. Dirk van de Wal's History of Modern Libya, good intro. Ronald Brusson has a good one if you want to know just about the US connection to Libya and you're particularly interested in the war we fought in 1805 with the Barbary pirates. So that's Ronald Bruce St. John, 2 Centuries of Strife. My overview of the revolution, the 2011 Libyan uprisings and the struggle for the post-Qadhafi future, is kind of the definitive treatment of the multiplicity of the uprisings in 2011. And that's a good place to get started if you want to find out about what really happened in 2011 from an academic perspective. But then books are not going to be able to take you into the post-Qadhafi period. Although I am working on a book about post-Qadhafi Libya, it's a series of think tank reports. And I would like to direct you to the work of Tim Eaton at Chatham House for things relating to the economy, as why It's the Economy Stupid, published by I in Rome, and An International Financial Commission is Libya's Last Hope, published by the Middle East Institute, if you want to look at kind of what's going on in Libya post-Qadhafi and the importance of economic drivers.
All right, in our last few minutes, you can answer this question. Could you speak about Tunisian and Algerian interests in Libya, as well as any other neighboring states that might play a role in the conflict?
Wow. So Libya borders 7 countries, all of which have profound existential reasons to be involved. I'll actually start in the east. Egypt. Egypt may not be the primary funder of Haftar and the LNA, but they're the ones most affected. Their border is very long, and there's been a lot of smuggling of arms and terrorists from 2014 onward. The Coptic Christians were beheaded in Sirte in January 2015. And whether you think Sisi should support Haftar or not, you got to give him credit. The way in which they've done it has made their border safer. The LNA has decreased the smuggling at that border. So moving then south, the Sudanese are very involved in Libya. Right now, Hemeti, essentially their military dictator, deploys his rapid support force. So the Emiratis pay for it, and he deploys it as a mercenary force. Then if you go to Chad, moving as we are clockwise, the Chadians have to stop migrants coming up and into Libya, so they sell their services to the European Union for training, but they have militias, particularly Tebu militias, that they have to deal with. And then we move on to Niger. Niger has connections to various Qadhafi elements, and also it has to block the migrants, and it gets EU support. Then continuing up north and slightly further west, because we're going clockwise, Algeria. Algeria has a very mature role when it comes to Libya. They are not that biased. They understand that if Libya implodes, they're screwed. So they don't commit to one side or the other. They have a very positive mediation. And the new leader there, Tebboune, has been trying to establish himself as the top neutral mediator. And I like his approach a lot. Then you look at the Tunisians. Tunisia is to the war in Libya what Jordan was to the war in Iraq. It's where all the embassies are based. Now that it's not safe enough in Tripoli, it's where all the NGOs and where all the businesses are based. So Tunisia houses all of the NGOs, embassies, and the Tunisians are very worried about blowback when it comes to jihadis. So they, like the Algerians, are very positive, they're very neutral, and they want to see Libya succeed so that they can create jobs and stop their youth from going to get terrorist training inside Libya.
Okay, we're going to have to stop it there if we can. Again, Jason, we're incredibly grateful. This has been a fantastic presentation. Thank you to Michael and all of our colleagues in the National Council. And we have another lecture coming up on Thursday. We'll get the invites out soon, and we hope to see you there. Thank you, everyone, for participating.